very great pleasure to introduce this exciting session. GD, it came to our attention about fish carbon at the very beginning of the science, and we thought it was incredibly important, it was incredibly new, and a really innovative science about how marine biodiversity can help support climate change mitigation. So it is with great pleasure to have supported this effort as well, and work with long-term partners of Grid Arundel as well as Jim Toomey as well. So we're very, very pleased. I'd like to introduce Dr. Heidi Pearson. She's a Fulbright scholar and she's working with Grid Arundel around this topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks for everyone for coming. And I have the privilege of giving this presentation with Stephen Lutz, who's the Blue Carbon Program Manager at Grid Arundel, and also Jim Toomey of Sherman's Lagoon. So everyone loves poo, but did you know that there are actually different kinds of poo in the ocean? So whales, they produce lots of poo, it's buoyant, and so it floats at the surface of the ocean. Fish poo, on the other hand, is very small. It's also very heavy, and so it sinks. But what does this have to do with climate change? Well, whales are involved in something called the whale pump. So they all have to dive for their food, but then they're tied to the surface of the water where they have to come up and breathe. And during this time, they also release these big fecal plumes that are rich in nutrients. These nutrients then are taken up by phytoplankton, which they need to grow. Phytoplankton, just like plants on land, absorb carbon dioxide. So with more whales, we can have more nutrients, which spurs the growth of more phytoplankton, trapping more carbon. Some fish are involved in something called twilight zone carbon. So these fish come to the surface at night to feed, and during the day, they sink to depth. And while they're at depth during the day, they are producing fecal plumes. These are fecal pellets, excuse me. These pellets are rich in carbon, and they're also very heavy. They can actually sink about 1,000 meters a day. So as these fecal pellets are sinking, they're bringing all of that carbon with them, which if it reaches the deep ocean can be trapped for hundreds to thousands of years. And all of this poo can really add up. So in terms of the whale pump, it's been studied with sperm whales in the Southern Ocean, and the scientists used an estimate of 120,000 sperm whales that would have lived here pre-whaling. And all of their poo would have stimulated the carbon capture of about 2 million metric tons each year. So to put this in perspective, if you think in terms of carbon captured by trees, it's about 35,000 square kilometers, or about the area of Taiwan. Now thinking about those twilight zone fish, a study off the western coast of North America found that lanternfish can help to trap up to 30 million metric tons of carbon each year through production of those carbon-rich fecal pellets that sink to the bottom of the ocean. And again, in terms of trees, this is equivalent to about 500,000 square kilometers of carbon captured each year, and that's about the size of Spain. So fish carbon, also called oceanic blue carbon, is the carbon that's naturally trapped and stored by marine life. So I just briefly touched on two of these pathways, the whale pump and twilight zone carbon, but we've actually identified 9 different ways that marine vertebrates in particular can trap and store carbon and possibly be an effort to mitigate climate change. So to learn more, we have created a story map at Grid. We invite you to visit this, and this is based on peer-reviewed data and scientific literature that summarizes all of these mechanisms. So just briefly to go through some screenshots of this story map, you'll first be given some information on oceanic blue carbon in general to set up some foundation knowledge. Then you can go through all of the 9 different pathways. Each pathway will be lit up, and then you'll have a description of that pathway. Next, you can view the fish carbon video, which Jim Toomey will be launching here for the first time in just a few minutes. And then you come to a map of the globe, which will spin to the geographic location where each of these mechanisms has been studied. So you'll see the animal, where it's been studied, and then the data associated with that. And then finally, you can learn about why oceanic blue carbon is important, and I'll turn it over to Stephen. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you. So I'm going to give some quick comments on policy or potential policy ramifications of the fish carbon or oceanic blue carbon approach. And the idea is that this is a slide that was put together by the World Wildlife Fund back in 2015. And the idea is, what is the climate mitigation value of a living ocean versus a depleted one? Now, given the mechanisms which Heidi presented, and remember, these are just the beginning stages of science for these mechanisms, I think there's an exciting potential to link potentially the restoration of the world's fisheries to climate action. Or I could just propose the question, which ocean do you think would have more biological carbon sequestration, potentially, the one from the 1950s or the one from the 2000s? I'll leave that up to you. And this policy is actually not without precedence. So just earlier this year, at a meeting of the International Whaling Commission in Brazil, a number of countries got together and endorsed two resolutions. 41 countries endorsed two resolutions at the International Whaling Commission that recognize the value of whale carbon. So the value of whale carbon is already being used to help support sustainable management of marine mammals. Okay. And that brings us to the sort of question is, so what? So there's all these mechanisms out there, there's these interesting mechanisms, but the real question here is, what is the total significance of this? Is it just something interesting, or is it really valuable? And then the next step is, can we translate or harness this value to achieve goals in sustainable management, conservation, and climate change? And the last question that I have is, given the recent IPCC report illustrating that we have to do everything in the toolbox to help mitigate climate change and prevent the disasters, the global disasters that the IPCC warns about, can we afford not to recognize the value of fish carbon and explore this for climate mitigation? Thank you. I'm going to leave the floor to Jim.
Thank you. So I'm the filmmaker of this short film. It's been a real pleasure to make this film about whale poo. It's sort of going back to my 12-year-old boy self to make this. So for me, it was a lot of fun. We filmed this in Formentera, Spain, an island in the Mediterranean, and we were in the middle of a tour of the Mediterranean, and we really had to look hard to find aquatic grass and aquatic vegetation in the Mediterranean. And as we were making this film, it really drove home to me the value of this particular vector for carbon sequestration in this particular area. So there's different parts of the world where different vectors for carbon sequestration are important, and this part of the world was one of them. And for me, it really drove home that in this geographical location. So without any further ado, we'll launch this and hope for the best.
Life on Earth is a balancing act in many ways. Take the air we breathe, for example. Animals like us breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants pretty much do the opposite. When you put these two natural processes together, it forms a balancing act that has allowed our atmosphere to support life for hundreds of millions of years. But with all the new sources of carbon dioxide that we've introduced relatively recently, like planes, trains, automobiles, and power plants, we're now putting more CO2 into our atmosphere than the Earth's carbon cycle can absorb. And so a balancing act that has lasted hundreds of millions of years is now out of balance, resulting in a net gain of atmospheric CO2. That increase in CO2 has many ramifications, including climate change, sea level rise, and ocean acidification, just to name a few. In order to reverse these trends and mitigate the damage, we'll need to reduce our fossil fuel use on one hand and increase our planet's capacity to absorb CO2 on the other. Most of us are aware that trees and other terrestrial plants are a big part of the carbon cycle, but we may not be aware that more CO2 is absorbed by life in the ocean than by life on land. We call this CO2 absorbed by ocean organisms blue carbon. When we think of blue carbon mechanisms, we commonly think of the plants, mangroves, kelp, seagrass, and saltwater marshes, and microorganisms like plankton. What doesn't get much consideration is the role of all that marine life in the middle, the fish, the mammals, the turtles, and other marine vertebrates. These animals play a vital role in how the ocean absorbs carbon. Here's how. Marine vertebrates keep coastal habitats healthy. When we take away the vertebrates, mangroves, kelp, and seagrasses can suffer due to unchecked grazing and burrowing by herbivores. These plants absorb way more carbon per acre than land forests. Because denser particles sink, many nutrients end up at the bottom of the ocean. Whales and fish physically mix the water column by swimming vertically through the oceans, providing nutrients to plants at the surface, plants that absorb carbon. Whales have another ocean mixing trick. They feed at one level and, well, poop at another. Because whales poop at the surface, this process moves nutrients from the deep water where they feed to waters where microorganisms like plankton can thrive and absorb carbon. Whales not only mix up the water column, they mix things up horizontally as well. Whales travel thousands of miles, feeding and producing waste products along the way. Whale fecal matter stimulates plankton production, and we know that plankton is a major consumer of CO2. This horizontal mixing allows more plankton to thrive at lower latitudes. When other marine vertebrates consume carbon-based food, they essentially repackage it. Some of that waste product sinks to the bottom, where it is permanently sequestered or retired from the carbon cycle. Some fish, like tuna, halibut, and herring, produce calcium carbonate as waste product, which can potentially offset the effects of ocean acidification. Marine vertebrates store carbon the same way forests do, as biomass, with larger individuals storing proportionally greater amounts over prolonged timescales. When large marine vertebrates die and sink to the bottom, they bring with them lots of carbon in their bodies. Once on the ocean floor, some of that carbon gets buried and is retired from the carbon cycle. It's important to consider the role that each element of nature plays in this complex balancing act of life on Earth. And when we consider marine vertebrates, we should consider them more than just a food source. They play a key role in keeping the ocean healthy, because they actually increase the ocean's capacity to absorb carbon. They play a key role in keeping the planet healthy.
We have 2 or 3 minutes for questions for Stephen or Heidi, if you have anything on fish carbon.
Does anybody want to know more? Please.
So who's talking about the blue carbon economy? Like, we see it here. I have mentioned to you before, there's a conference on sustainable blue economy in Nairobi coming up in Kenya in November.
Yeah.
Is it gaining more popularity with the discoveries of how useful it is?
Yes, so coastal blue carbon is already recognized in over 40 nationally determined contributions to the Paris Climate Agreement. But that's coastal blue carbon in terms of adaptation and mitigation. What we don't have is the role of the oceans. And I think this is this type of an approach is very attractive to small island developing states, or should I say large ocean states. And so we have a press release coming out today, and Ronnie Jeannot, who's the ambassador for the oceans for the Seychelles, has it in a quote about how this is an important potential mechanism for the Seychelles and other small islands. But we're at the very beginning stages for oceanic blue carbon. And I think coastal blue carbon has really paved the way for the recognition of this coastal ecosystem services in policy and management, not only in the UAE through the Abu Dhabi Blue Carbon Demonstration Project and then the upscaling nationally, but internationally. And through the UN Environment Blue Forest Project, we're exploring how coastal blue carbon can be harnessed to meet our goals in conservation and sustainable management. But it's just beginning for the oceans. But the idea is, as the Paris rulebook comes together, the rulebook for implementing the Paris Climate Agreement, the idea is to keep the door open for the oceans and to not close it on ocean options. I hope that answered your question.
You mentioned about the lanternfish. Is it about the entire population sequestering that much carbon, 30 million ton, or it's part of the population? Can you just explain?
Sure. So that particular study looked at lanternfish and other fish called myctophids that do that same twilight zone migration. And so this was about if you want to call it a population or a stock that inhabits this area off the coast of all the way from Washington down to California. So I don't have the actual population number, but they did some extrapolations from the fish that they sampled to the whole area.
Thank you for the presentation. Just a question regarding any threats regarding reverse the whole process. So instead of storing carbon, any threats that those carbon has been stored, they could release back. It's like a tree when we plant it and store carbon, any threat in burning and things like reverse it back. Thank you.
So I think the threat that you would look at that we've looked at from oceanic blue carbon would be overfishing potentially, but definitely there are papers that have been published on the overfishing of whales. So looking at how before whaling there was many more whales in the ocean, and this sequestered a lot more carbon than the existing populations. So I think the key thing is the restoration of fisheries and to stop the overfishing. So if we deplete our fisheries and cause the fisheries to crash, then that would be I guess the reducing of the oceanic carbon function. Does that answer your question?
I think part of it.
Okay.
But, the part, with the cycle itself, once being stored, all of the carbon is moving down to the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah.
Any threats that could those cycle be a reverse?
So presumably bottom trawling, if you're going to, bottom trawling might stir up the sediments. We haven't really gone into that side of, because it's so new, we haven't really gone into that side of what could stir up the sediments and that sort of thing. But yeah, anything that could resuspend the sediment would probably potentially reduce.
I have a question. Back to the question of my colleague, we know that there is a wetland supplement that have been developed a few years ago by the IPCC, and now they are refreshment of the wetland supplements. So there will be new chapters that will be revised. So in that aspect, do you think that the science of this fish carbon will be included in the new supplement or the
I think we're a bit far away from doing that. And if I propose that, my colleagues in Coastal Blue Carbon would probably lynch me. So, don't forget #OceanicBlueCarbon. Thank you so much.